The 1958 US-UK Mutual Defense Agreement, or UKUS Mutual Defense Agreement, is a bilateral treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom on nuclear weapons cooperation. The treaty's full name is Agreement between the Government of the United States of America and the Government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for cooperation on the uses of atomic energy for mutual defense purposes. It allows the United States and the UK to exchange nuclear materials, technology, and information. While the US has nuclear cooperation agreements with other countries, including France and other NATO countries, this agreement is by far the most comprehensive. Because of the agreement's strategic value to Britain, Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister who presided over the United Kingdom's entry into the agreement, called it the Great Prize. The treaty was signed on July 3, 1958, after the Soviet Union shocked the American public with the launch of Sputnik on October 4, 1957, and the British hydrogen bomb program successfully tested a thermonuclear device in the Operation Grapple test on November 8. The Anglo-American special relationship proved mutually beneficial. Although it was never one of equals, the United States was, and is, far larger than Britain both militarily and economically. Britain soon became dependent on the United States for its nuclear weapons, as it lacked the resources to produce a range of designs. The treaty allowed American nuclear weapons to be supplied to Britain through Project E, for use by the Royal Air Force and British Army of the Rhine. The treaty provided for the sale to the UK of one complete nuclear submarine propulsion plant, plus 10 years' supply of enriched uranium to fuel it. Other nuclear material was also acquired from the United States under the treaty. Some 5.4 tons of UK-produced plutonium was sent to the US in return for 6.7 kilograms, 15 pounds, of tritium and 7.5 tons of highly enriched uranium, HEU, between 1960 and 1979, although much of the HEU was used not for weapons, but as fuel for the growing fleet of UK nuclear submarines. The treaty paved the way for the Polaris sales agreement, and the Royal Navy ultimately acquired entire weapons systems, with the UK Polaris program and Trident nuclear program using American missiles with British nuclear warheads. The treaty has been amended and renewed 9 times. The most recent renewal extended it to December 31, 2024. During the early part of the Second World War, Britain had a nuclear weapons project, codenamed Two Alloys. At the Quadrant Conference in August 1943, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, and the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, signed the Quebec Agreement, which merged Two Alloys with the American Manhattan Project to create a combined British, American and Canadian project. The Quebec Agreement established the Combined Policy Committee and the Combined Development Trust to coordinate their efforts. Many of Britain's top scientists participated in the Manhattan Project. The September 1944 Hyde Parkade memoir extended both commercial and military cooperation into the post-war period, but Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, and it was not binding on subsequent administrations. In fact, it was physically lost. When Field Marshal Sir Henry Maitland Wilson raised the matter in a Combined Policy Committee meeting in June 1945, the American copy could not be found. The Quebec Agreement specified that nuclear weapons would not be used against another country without mutual consent. On July 4, Wilson gave British agreement for the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. On August 8, the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, sent a message to President Harry Truman in which he referred to themselves as heads of the governments which have control of this great force. The British government had trusted that the United States would continue to share nuclear technology, which it considered to be a joint discovery. On November 9, 1945, Attlee and the Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie King, went to Washington, D.C., to confer with Truman about future cooperation in nuclear weapons and nuclear power. A memorandum of intention they signed on November 16, 1945 made Canada a full partner, and replaced the Quebec Agreement's requirement for a mutual consent before using nuclear weapons with one for prior consultation. There was to be full and effective cooperation in the field of atomic energy, but British hopes were soon disappointed. This was only in the field of basic scientific research. Technical cooperation was ended by the United States Atomic Energy Act of 1946, McMahon Act, which forbade passing restricted data to the United States allies under pain of death. This partly resulted from the arrest for espionage of British physicist Alan Nunn in February 1946, while the legislation was being debated. Fearing a resurgence of American isolationism, and Britain losing its great power status, the British government restarted its own development effort, now codenamed High Explosive Research. By the end of 1947, 1,900 long tons, 1,900 t, of uranium ore from the Belgian Congo was stockpiled for the Combined Development Trust at Springfields, near Preston in Lancashire, as part of a wartime sharing agreement, along with 1,350 long tons, 1,370 t, for British use. To gain access to the stockpile for their own nuclear weapons project, the Americans opened negotiations that resulted in the modus vivendi, an agreement which was signed on January 7, 1948. This officially terminated all previous agreements, including the Quebec Agreement. It removed the British right of consultation on the use of nuclear weapons, allowed for limited sharing of technical information between the United States, Britain, and Canada, and continued the Combined Policy Committee and the Combined Development Trust, although the latter was renamed the Combined Development Agency. In 1949, the Americans offered to make atomic bombs in the United States available for Britain to use if the British agreed to curtail their atomic bomb program. This would have given Britain nuclear weapons much sooner than its own target date of late 1952. Only those bomb components required by the war plans would be stored in the UK, the rest would be kept in the US and Canada. The offer was rejected by the British on the grounds that it was not compatible with our status as a first-class power to depend on others for weapons of this supreme importance. As a counter-offer, the British proposed limiting the British program in return for American bombs. The opposition of key American officials, including Lewis Strauss from the United States Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, and Senators Burt B. Hickenlooper and Arthur Vandenberg of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, JCAE, coupled with security concerns aroused by the February 2, 1950 arrest of the British physicist Klaus Fuchs as an atomic spy, caused the proposal to be dropped. The June 1951 defection of Donald Macmillan, who had served as a British member of the Combined Policy Committee from January 1947 to August 1948, reinforced the Americans' distrust of British security arrangements. The first British atomic bomb was successfully tested in Western Australia in Operation Hurricane on October 3, 1952. But although it was more advanced than the American bombs of 1946, Britain was still several years behind in nuclear weapons technology. On November 1, the United States conducted Ivy Mike, the first nuclear test of a true thermonuclear device, also known as a hydrogen bomb. The JCAE saw little benefit for the United States from sharing technology with Britain. The Soviet Union responded to Ivy Mike with the test of Joan 4, a boosted fission weapon on August 12, 1953. This prompted President Dwight Eisenhower, who was inaugurated in January 1953, to inform the United States Congress that the McMahon Act, which he considered a terrible piece of legislation and one of the most deplorable incidents in American history of which he personally felt ashamed, was obsolete. At the three-hour Bermuda Conference in December 1953, Eisenhower and Churchill, who had become Prime Minister again on October 25, 1951, discussed the possibility of the United States giving Britain access to American nuclear weapons in wartime. This came to be called Project E. There were technical and legal issues that had to be overcome before American bombs could be carried in British aircraft. The United States would have to disclose their weights and dimensions, while their delivery would require data concerning their ballistics. Further down the track, there would also be issues of custody, security, and targeting. The release of such information was restricted by the McMahon Act. This was amended on August 30, 1954 by the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, which allowed for greater exchange of information with foreign nations, paving the way for the Agreement for Cooperation regarding Atomic Information for Mutual Defense Purposes, which was signed on June 15, 1955. On June 13, 1956, another agreement was concluded for the transfer of nuclear submarine propulsion technology to Britain, saving the British government millions of pounds in research and development costs. This precipitated a row with the JCAE over whether this was permitted under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, and whether Britain met the security standards set by the 1955 agreement. With the 1956 presidential election approaching, Eisenhower was forced to rescind the offer. The October 1956 Suez Crisis brought relations between Britain and the United States to a low ebb. When Eisenhower met with the new Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, in Bermuda in March 1957, he raised the possibility of basing U.S. intermediate-range ballistic missile (IRBM) systems in the UK. This came to be called Project Emily. There were also discussions on exchanging nuclear submarine propulsion technology for information on the British Calder Hall nuclear power plant, allowing the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, UKAEA, to purchase uranium ore from Canada, and coordinating the war plans of RAF Bomber Command with those of the Strategic Air Command. Although the IRBM negotiations predated the Suez Crisis, it suited the British government to tout the IRBM deal as a demonstration that the rift had been healed. The British hydrogen bomb program attempted to detonate a thermonuclear device in the Operation Grapple test series at Christmas Island in the Pacific. The test series was facilitated by the United States, which also claimed the island. Although the first tests were unsuccessful, the Grapple X test on November 8 achieved the desired result. The successful development of British thermonuclear weapons came at an opportune time to renew negotiations with the United States. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, on October 4, 1957, came as a tremendous shock to the American public, who had trusted that American technological superiority ensured their invulnerability. Now, suddenly, there was incontrovertible proof that, in some areas at least, the Soviet Union was actually ahead. In the widespread calls for action in response to the Sputnik crisis, officials in the United States and Britain seized an opportunity to mend their relationship. At the suggestion of Harold Kocha, the British ambassador to the United States, Macmillan wrote to Eisenhower on October 10 urging that the two countries pool their resources, as Macmillan put it, to meet the Soviet challenge on every front, military, economic and political. Macmillan flew to Washington, D.C., for talks on October 25. He had concerns that the disastrous October 10 wind-scale fire might prove a stumbling block in negotiations, as it might reflect badly on British expertise and provide ammunition for opponents of closer cooperation with the UK. He ordered extra copies of the report into the fire to be destroyed, and for the printers to destroy their type. He immediately sensed how shaken the Americans had been by Sputnik. It placed the Eisenhower administration under great public pressure to act on the deployment of IRBMs by a shocked and distraught nation. Eisenhower and Macmillan agreed to form a study group headed by Sir Richard Powell, the permanent secretary to the Ministry of Defense, and Donald A. Quarles, the United States Deputy Secretary of Defense, to consider how the deployment of IRBMs to Britain might be expedited. Another study group, under Strauss and Sir Edwin Plowden, the head of the UKAEA, would investigate nuclear cooperation in the exchange of nuclear information. The personal relationship developed between Plowden and Strauss would be crucial in converting the latter over to the idea of providing information to Britain. By December, most of the issues with the IRBM negotiations had been ironed out, and a formal agreement was drawn up on December 17, although it was not until the end of the month that it was definitely determined that Britain would receive Thor and not Jupiter missiles. However, the nuclear submarine propulsion effort was running into trouble. Under the July 1956 agreement and a February 1957 directive from Eisenhower, Royal Navy officers had been assigned to study the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine program. By October 1957, its head, Rear Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, felt that their questions were slowing the deployment of the Polaris submarine-launched IRBM at a critical time. He feared that any delay might cause Congress to favor land-based missiles. By December, the British liaison officers were complaining of slow response to their questions. Rickover proposed that Westinghouse be permitted to sell the Royal Navy a nuclear submarine reactor, which would allow it to immediately proceed with building its own nuclear-powered submarine. The British government endorsed this idea, as it would save it a great deal of money. For their part, the British wanted the McMahon Act's restrictions on nuclear cooperation to be relaxed. They wanted to know the weight and dimensions, fusing and firing sequences, safety features, and in-flight procedures, the information that would allow American bombs to be carried in British V-bombers, and American warheads to be fitted to British Blue Streak missiles. This would potentially save millions of pounds and avoid domestic political complications if Britain had to persist with nuclear testing during an international moratorium. While the British knew what they wanted, there was no consensus among the Americans as to what they wanted to provide. The United States Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was concerned that a special relationship with Britain might complicate the United States' relationships with its other allies. Strauss in particular felt that a proposal to give hydrogen bomb secrets to the British would likely not get past the JCAE, and counseled drafting amendments that were sufficiently vague as to give the President the authority he needed without arousing its ire. Eisenhower declared that the US and UK were interdependent, and pledged to ask Congress to amend the McMahon Act. Crucially, he managed to secure the support of Carl T. Durham, the chairman of the JCAE. Eisenhower met with congressional leaders on December 3, 1957, and pressed for more discretion to cooperate with all America's NATO allies, and not just Britain. Indeed, the administration negotiated agreements with Australia, Canada, and NATO. While Eisenhower did not yet have wholehearted support for the proposal, outright opposition from Senator Clinton P. Anderson failed to attract much support. On January 27, 1958, Strauss sent Durham the administration's proposed legislative changes, and the JCAE Subcommittee on Agreements for Cooperation, chaired by Senator John O. Pastor, held hearings from 29 to January 31. Quarles and Major General Herbert Loper, the assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Atomic Energy Affairs, were forced to deal with pointed questions about nuclear proliferation. British information security, or the lack thereof, no longer seemed so important now that the Soviet Union was apparently ahead, and the United Kingdom had independently developed the hydrogen bomb, but the JCAE objected to the terms of the proposed deal to trade British uranium-235 for American plutonium, under which the U.S. would pay USD $30 per gram for plutonium that cost USD $12 per gram to produce in the UK. The amendments were passed by the House of Representatives on June 19, but not without changes. It now limited exchanges of nuclear weapons data to nations that had made substantial progress in the field. The same restriction applied to the actual transfer of non-nuclear components of nuclear weapons. American nuclear weapons were to remain under U.S. custody and could only be turned over to allies in the event of war. The sale of nuclear reactors for submarines and nuclear fuel for them and other military reactors was permitted. Only Britain qualified as a nation that had made substantial progress. The bill passed Congress on June 30, 1958, and was signed into law by Eisenhower on July 2, 1958. The 1958 US-UK Mutual Defense Agreement was signed by Dulles and Samuel Hood, the British minister in Washington, D.C., on July 3, and approved by Congress on July 30. The agreement enables the US and the UK to exchange classified information with the objective of improving each party's atomic weapon design, development, and fabrication capability. While the US has nuclear cooperation agreements with other countries, including France and some NATO countries, none are similar in scope to the US-UK Mutual Defense Agreement. Macmillan called it the Great Prize. Article 2 of the treaty covered joint development of defense plans, the mutual training of personnel and the use and defense against nuclear weapons, the sharing of intelligence and evaluation of enemy capabilities, the development of nuclear delivery systems, and the research, development, and design of military reactors. The treaty called for the exchange of classified information concerning atomic weapons when, after consultation with the other party, the communicating party determines that the communication of such information is necessary to improve the recipient's atomic weapon design, development, and fabrication capability. The U.S. would communicate information about atomic weapons that were similar to British atomic weapons. For the immediate future, that would exclude information about thermonuclear weapons. Confidential intelligence matters are also covered by the agreement. The UK government has not published these sections because of the necessity for great confidentiality and because of the use that such information would be to other would-be nuclear states. In other words, it might well assist proliferation. Article 3 provided for the sale to the UK of one complete nuclear submarine propulsion plant, plus the uranium needed to fuel it for 10 years. Due to concerns expressed by the JCAE, the ADC would determine the price that Britain would pay for highly enriched uranium, HEU. The treaty did not allow for non-nuclear components of nuclear weapons to be given to Britain. It was amended on May 7, 1959 to give Britain access to non-nuclear components, and to permit the transfer of special nuclear materials such as plutonium, HEU, and tritium. The treaty paved the way for the subsequent Polaris Sales Agreement, which was signed on April 6, 1963. The two agreements have been the cornerstone of the UK-US nuclear relationship for nearly 60 years. The AEC invited the British government to send representatives to a series of meetings in Washington, D.C., on 27 and August 28, 1958 to work out the details. The U.S. delegation included Willard Libby, AEC Deputy Chairman, Loper, Brigadier General Alfred Starbird, AEC Director of Military Applications, Norris Bradbury, Director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Edward Teller, Director of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and James W. McRae, President of the Sandia Corporation. The British representatives were Sir Frederick Brundrett, the chief scientific advisor to the Ministry of Defence, and Victor Macmillan from the Ministry of Defence, and William Penny, William Cook, and E.F. Newley from the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston. The Americans disclosed the details of 9 of their nuclear weapon designs: the Mark 7, Mark 15 39s, Mark 19, Mark 25, Mark 27, Mark 28, Mark 31, Mark 33 and Mark 34. In return, the British provided the details of 7 of theirs, including Green Grass, Pennant, the boosted device which had been detonated in the Grapple-Z test on August 22, Flagpole, the 2-stage device scheduled for September 2, Burgee, scheduled for September 23, and the 3-stage Halliard-3. The Americans were impressed with the British designs, particularly with Halliard-1, the heavier version of Halliard-3. Cook therefore changed the Grapple-Z program to fire Halliard-1 instead of Halliard-3. Macmillan noted in his diary, with satisfaction, that in some respects we are as far, and even further, advanced in the art than our American friends. They thought interchange of information would be all give. They are keen that we should complete our series, especially the last megaton, the character of which is novel and of deep interest to them. An early benefit of the agreement was to allow the UK to anglicize the W-28 nuclear warhead as the Red Snow warhead for the Blue Steel missile. The British designers were impressed by the W-28, which was not only lighter than the British Green Grass warhead used in Yellow Sun, but remarkably more economical in its use of expensive fissile material. The Yellow Sun Mark II using Red Snow cost £500,000 compared with £1,200,000 for the Mark I with Green Grass. A 1974 CIA proliferation assessment noted that, in many cases, Britain's sensitive technology in nuclear and missile fields is based on technology received from the US and could not legitimately be passed on without US permission. The UK National Audit Office noted that most of the UK Trident program warhead development and production expenditure was incurred in the US, which supplied special materials and certain warhead-related components and services. There is evidence that the warhead design of the British Trident system is similar to, or even based upon, the US W-76 warhead fitted in US Navy Trident missiles, with design and blast model data supplied to the UK. Britain soon became dependent on the United States for its nuclear weapons, as it lacked the resources to produce a range of designs. The treaty allowed the UK to receive US nuclear weapons for the Royal Air Force, RAF, and British Army of the Rhine, BAOR. Under Project E, similar custody arrangements were made for the Thor missile supplied under Project Emily. The UK was able to carry out underground nuclear tests at the US Nevada test site, where the first British test took place on March 1, 1962. British nuclear testing in the United States continued until abruptly halted by President George H.W. Bush in October 1992. Major subcritical nuclear tests continued to occur, most notably the Etna test in February 2002, and the Krakatoa test in February 2006. Under the agreement, 5.37 tons of UK-produced plutonium was sent to the US in exchange for 6.7 kilograms of tritium and 7.5 tons of HEU between 1960 and 1979. A further 470 kilograms of plutonium was swapped between the US and the UK for reasons that remain classified. Some of the UK-produced plutonium was used in 1962 by the US for the only known nuclear weapon test of reactor-grade plutonium. The plutonium sent to the US included some produced in UK civil Magnox reactors, and the US gave assurances that this civil plutonium was not used in the US nuclear weapons program. It was used in civil programs which included Californium production and reactor research. Some of the fissile materials for the UK Trident warhead were purchased from the US, but much of the HEU supplied by the US was used not for weapons, but as fuel for the growing fleet of UK nuclear submarines. Under the treaty, the US supplied the UK with not just nuclear submarine propulsion technology, but a complete S-5W pressurized water reactor of the kind used to power the US Skipjack-class submarines. This was used in the Royal Navy's first nuclear-powered submarine, HMS Dreadnought, which was launched in 1960 and commissioned in 1963. The S-5W was fueled by uranium enriched to between 93 and 97% or uranium-235. Reactor technology was transferred from Westinghouse to Rolls-Royce, which used it as the basis for its PWR-1 reactor used in the UK's Valiant, Resolution, Churchill, Swiftsure, and Trafalgar submarines. The UK produced HEU at its facility in Capenhurst, but production for military purposes ceased there in March 1963. Thereafter, uranium oxide was imported from Australia, Canada, Namibia, South Africa, the United States and Zaire, and processed into uranium hexafluoride at Springfields. It was then shipped to the U.S., where it was enriched at the Portsmouth Gaseous Diffusion Plant near Piketon, Ohio. HEU was then flown back to the UK in RAF aircraft. In 1994, with the Portsmouth plant about to close, the treaty was amended, with the U.S. requirement to provide uranium enrichment services changed to one to arrange them. By March 2002, the UK had a stockpile of 21.86 tons of HEU, about 80 years' supply for the Royal Navy's nuclear-powered submarines. Most of the activity under the treaty is information exchange through joint working groups, JOG. At least 15 of these were established in 1959. Subjects investigated included 1-point safety, computer codes, metallurgy, and fabrication technology for beryllium, uranium and plutonium, corrosion of uranium in the presence of water and water vapor, underground effects tests, outer space testing, clandestine testing, the technology of lithium compounds, high explosives, deuterium monitors, extinguishing plutonium fires, high-speed cameras, mechanical safing, liquid and solid explosive shock initiation, environmental sensing switches, neutron sources, tritium reservoirs, telemetry, hydrodynamic and shock relations for problems with spherical and cylindrical symmetry, nuclear cross-sections, radiochemistry, atomic demolition munitions, warhead hardening, asymmetric detonations, terrorist nuclear threat response, nuclear weapons accidents and waste management. Between 2007 and 2009, staff of the Atomic Weapons Establishment paid 2,000 visits to U.S. nuclear facilities. As of 2014, there are also 2 enhanced collaborations jointly developing capabilities. Enhanced nuclear safety, to develop architectures and technologies related to warhead safety, and Warhead Electrical System, to develop architectures and technologies for warhead electrical systems. The Anglo-American special relationship proved mutually beneficial. Although it was never one of equals, the United States was far larger than Britain both militarily and economically. Lorna Arnold noted that the balance of advantage in the exchanges was necessarily in Britain's favor, but they were not entirely one-sided. In some areas, notably electronics and high explosives, the British were equal or perhaps even superior, and in many areas they had valuable ideas to contribute, as the American scientists, and notably Teller, appreciated. A 1985 report by the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research reported that the U.S. was profoundly involved and benefited greatly from the treaty. The treaty was amended on May 7, 1959, September 27, 1968, October 16, 1969, June 22, 1974, December 5, 1979, June 5, 1984, May 23, 1994, and June 14, 2004. Most amendments nearly extended the treaty for another 5 or 10 years, others added definitions and made minor changes. As of 2020, the most recent renewal was on July 22, 2014, extending the treaty to December 31, 2024, with minor changes for the Trident nuclear program. A 2004 legal opinion obtained by the British American Security Information Council, BASIC, argued that renewal of the treaty violated Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which required signatories to take steps towards nuclear disarmament. This was not accepted by the British government. In July 2014, Baroness Worsley, the Senior Minister of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs from 2012 to 2014, stated that the government's position was that we are committed to the goal of a world without nuclear weapons and firmly believe that the best way to achieve this is through gradual disarmament negotiated through a step-by-step approach within the framework of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The UK has a strong record on nuclear disarmament and continues to be at the forefront of international efforts to control proliferation and to make progress towards multilateral nuclear disarmament. The UKUS Mutual Defense Agreement is, and will continue to be, in full compliance with our obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty,